The first light of dawn slid across the stone courtyard like a slow-moving shadow, brushing pale gold over the cracked tiles yet failing to warm them. The palace lay still, but not with the stillness of peace. It was the quiet that comes when fear has settled in every corner. The air seemed to carry weight, pressing down on every bowed head, on every pair of eyes that dared not lift from the ground. The servants moved like ghosts, their steps soundless, their hands quick but careful, as if even the clink of a jug against a cup might awaken something cruel. Near the far edge of the courtyard, where the neat rows of tiles gave way to a shallow depression of earth, a pond lay dormant. Its surface was a dull, muddy brown, unbroken except for the faint tremble of a morning breeze. It was there that Amelie knelt, her thin figure hunched against the chill. Her bare feet sank slightly into the damp earth, and her knees ached from the hard ground beneath them. The rough hem of her faded dress brushed the wet soil, soaking in the smell of rot and stagnant water. Her hands, trembling from more than just the cold, cupped the pond's murky offering. She lifted it slowly to her lips. The water tasted of earth and rust, gritty against her tongue, clinging to her teeth in a way that made her want to spit it out, but she didn't. She never did. Swallowing was part of the humiliation, part of the obedience expected of her. Somewhere behind her, she could hear the distant clatter of plates being prepared for the royal breakfast. The smell of warm bread drifted faintly in the air, cruel in its reminder of what she was denied. Her eyes lowered to the pond again, though she tried not to look too long. Most days, her reflection was a thing she barely recognized, skin dulled by dust, hair bound in a way that hid its natural shine, lips cracked from thirst. The surface shifted with the breeze, stretching her features into grotesque shapes, making her look more like a shadow of herself than the girl she once had been. And yet, just for a moment, something changed. The ripples stilled without warning, and the muddy brown deepened into a strange, burnished hue. The sunlight caught the water in an angle that was impossible from where she knelt, igniting a faint shimmer beneath the surface. She leaned closer without meaning to, her breath barely disturbing the quiet. The face that looked back at her was still hers, but not. The skin seemed warmer, touched by an inner light. The hollowness in her cheeks was gone, replaced by a subtle strength. And at the crown of her head, just where the morning light should not have reached, there was the faintest glimmer of gold. Her heart gave a slow, startled beat. She blinked and it was gone, only mud, brown and heavy, staring back at her as if mocking what she had just seen. Somewhere high above, the palace bells began to toll, breaking the moment and pulling her back into the weight of the day ahead. She rose carefully, but her eyes lingered on the pond. A whisper of something she could not yet name had been left behind in her chest, faint but stubborn, like a coal buried under ash, waiting for its chance to breathe. Amelie had been 10 years old when the world turned silent for her. Her mother's death came without warning, a sickness that took her in the night and left nothing but a body too still to wake. There were whispers that it had not been illness at all, that a shadow had passed through their hut hours before, but whispers were dangerous, and children who repeated them quickly learned to keep their mouths shut. In the days that followed, Amelie was taken away from the only home she had known. A woman in fine silk came to the village, her voice smooth with practiced sympathy. She spoke of the palace as a place of safety, of warm beds and steady food, of work that would keep Amelie busy but cared for. Amelie had no reason to doubt her. The woman carried the king's seal. She left with only a small bundle of clothes and her mother's beaded bracelet, not knowing she was stepping into a different kind of hunger. The first days in the palace were a blur of strange corridors and rules spoken in cold tones. She was not to speak unless spoken to. She was not to touch the polished walls or the carved pillars. She was to wake before dawn and clean until her hands ached. But soon, those rules narrowed into ones made just for her, rules no other servant seemed bound to follow. She was forbidden from eating with the other workers. She was told to drink only from the muddy pond at the far end of the courtyard, even when clean water was poured for everyone else. And she was never, under any circumstance, to look anyone in the eye, be they servant, guard, or royal. The one who had set these rules was the second queen. Younger than the king's first wife, she carried herself like a carved statue, perfect in form, cold in soul. The queen's eyes lingered too long on Amelie the first time they met, narrowing in a way that was both calculating and dangerous. She had beauty that turned heads in the court, but in Amelie she saw something that drew attention without effort, a quiet grace, a natural dignity that no jewels could mimic. It was not beauty alone the queen hated, it was that Amelie had it without trying, without permission. The punishments began subtly. A servant accidentally spilled stew on her dress, forcing her to work the rest of the day in stained clothes. Her sleeping mat was moved to a drafty corner where the cold bit through the nights. But humiliation grew bolder with time. On feast days she would be ordered to kneel in the courtyard, in full view of guests arriving for dinner, and drink from the muddy pond like an animal. The queen would pass by, her voice loud enough to carry, saying things like, "Be grateful the mud accepts you, few would." Emily learned the art of smallness. She moved quietly, kept her head bowed, trained her voice into silence. Even laughter, hers or anyone else's, became something distant. The bracelet from her mother was taken from her under the excuse of palace property rules. She had no friends, for the queen's shadow made her untouchable. Anyone who showed her kindness found themselves punished in ways that taught them to keep their distance. One afternoon, as the sun hung low and the courtyard filled with the sound of soft conversation, the queen ordered her to kneel before the pond. Foreign traders stood nearby, their bright silks and gold ornaments glittering in the fading light. Emily bent low, her hands dipping into the thick water, her face inches from the stench of rot. She could feel eyes on her, weighing her worth against the creatures that came to drink at night. The queen's laughter rang out, not a sound of joy but of possession, as if Emily's degradation were a performance she alone had the right to direct. In that moment, Emily realized that her silence was not just a rule, it was the queen's favorite crown. Every bowed head, every averted gaze, every swallow of muddy water was a jewel set into it. But deep within her, past the bitterness, past the shame, something else stirred. It was not yet defiance, not yet courage, only the faintest memory of her mother's voice, telling her that the earth does not keep its treasures hidden forever. The second queen's dislike of Emily should have burned itself out quickly, the way petty grievances often do, but instead it deepened into a fascination that was poisonous in its persistence. What began as idle cruelty, small humiliations slipped between daily orders, grew into an obsession. It was not enough for Emily to be invisible. The queen wanted her visibly lowered, each act of service turned into a spectacle of degradation. Soon the punishments became creative in their malice. She would be sent on errands designed to fail, asked to deliver trays of food too heavy for her arms so that she would stumble before the court, or commanded to polish the queen's silver while the guards walked through the room with muddy boots, undoing her work. At other times she would be ordered to stand perfectly still for hours in the sun, her bare feet burning on the hot tiles, just to prove she could endure it without complaint. The queen did not work alone. Her whispers threaded themselves through the palace walls, reaching the ears of cooks, guards, visiting merchants, even some members of the court. "The girl carries a curse," she would murmur. "That's why the king keeps her far from the royal table." Servants began to glance at Emily as if she carried sickness in her skin. They would step aside to avoid brushing against her, leave a broom leaning against the wall rather than place it in her hand. She was not merely poor or lowly, she was made untouchable. The mud became the queen's favorite symbol for that untouchability. It was easy, readily available, and impossible to avoid once it touched you. She ensured it clung to Emily in ways both literal and cruelly poetic. If she was sent to the kitchens, someone would accidentally spill muddy water where she had to walk. If she cleaned the floors, muddy footprints would appear moments after she finished. It was a mark the queen could summon at will, one that left no wound but bled dignity. One evening the humiliation reached its sharpest point. The palace was hosting a gathering of foreign envoys, the kind where every gesture was calculated to impress. The queen summoned Emily from her chores and ordered her to serve wine in the great hall. She was given no time to wash, no shoes for her feet, only a jug of sweet red wine and a line of goblets to fill. As she moved barefoot across the gleaming tiles, the guards stationed near the entrance stepped forward. At first she thought they meant to open the way for her, but instead one tipped a bucket, its contents thick, brown and cold, straight onto her skirt. The mud splashed high, staining the faded fabric and streaking her legs. The hall fell quiet for a breath. All eyes turned to her, the barefoot girl with a jug in her trembling hands, her dress heavy and dripping filth onto the floor. The queen's voice broke the silence, lilting as if amused by a private joke. "Careful," she told the envoys, "she brings a little of the earth's flavor wherever she goes." A few chuckled politely, unsure of the custom, but most looked away. Emily's cheeks burned, though not from shame alone. She continued to pour the wine, each step squelching softly as mud clung to her skin. Somewhere in the back of her mind she began to feel it, that the mud was more than filth. It was a chain the queen kept tightening, a reminder that Emily's place was to kneel in the dirt. But chains, she thought, could also be broken. And mud, under the right light, could hold the color of gold. The festival came once each year, A day when the palace swelled with color and sound until even the oldest stones seemed to hum with life. Banners of crimson and gold were hung from every balcony, their edges fluttering like flames in the warm wind. The air filled with the smells of roasting meats, honeyed bread, and spices brought from far-off coasts. Musicians tuned their drums and flutes in the courtyards, letting bright bursts of melody float through the corridors. For the workers, it was the one day when the rigid lines between master and servant blurred slightly. Everyone was promised new clothes, a good meal, and an afternoon of music and laughter. For weeks, the talk among the servants had been electric. Even those who usually kept their eyes down could not hide their smiles as they whispered about what the cooks were preparing, what colors their new garments would be. Amelie had listened quietly from the shadows, her fingers busy scrubbing steps or polishing brass, imagining herself among them for just one day. She had never attended the festival before, but she had seen the aftermath, the crumbs of sweet bread left in the corners, the soft glitter of spilled wine on the tiles, the lingering scent of flowers crushed beneath dancing feet. She allowed herself to dream of it just for a heartbeat at a time. But dreams were dangerous in the palace, especially if they were hers. 2 days before the festival, the second queen summoned her. She sat in the center of her chamber like a jewel set in gold, her smile smooth as silk and twice as sharp. "I hear you've been asking questions," she said, though Amelie had not spoken to anyone. "You imagine yourself in fine clothes, eating at the table with the others?" She leaned forward, her voice low. "A snake in silk is still a snake." The queen's punishment was spoken without hesitation. On the day of the festival, Amelie was to kneel at the muddy pond from sunrise to sunset, drinking only from its stagnant water. "To remind you," the queen said sweetly, "where you belong. The pond will keep you company far better than people ever could." When the morning of the festival came, Amelie stood at the pond's edge as the first light painted the palace walls. The sound of drums already echoed faintly from somewhere deep inside, their rhythms warm and alive, but out here the world felt damp and cold. She lowered herself to her knees, the earth soft beneath them, the smell of wet decay rising with every breath. The first sip was always the hardest. The water was thick and warm from sitting in the sun, carrying the taste of rotting leaves and something metallic beneath. It clung to her tongue, coating her throat as it slid down, as if it wanted to stay inside her. She swallowed quickly, trying not to gag. Her hands trembled from the chill in the air, but also from the knowledge that each passing hour would bring more laughter from the palace, more reminders of what she was missing. By midday the music had grown louder. She could hear bursts of song, the rhythmic clap of dancers' feet, the low murmur of voices raised in joy. Once, a roar of laughter rolled across the courtyard, so sudden and bright that she flinched. The sense of the feast carried to her on the breeze, slow-cooked meat, sweet figs, the tang of fermented drink, only to be washed away by the damp, earthy smell of the pond. She dipped her hands again, watching the muddy surface ripple. For a moment the sunlight caught in a strange way, glinting just beneath the brown. It was nothing she could name, too faint to be a reflection, too warm to be a trick of the eye. She blinked and it was gone, leaving only the heavy surface that swallowed her image whole. The hours crawled by. Her knees grew numb, her shoulders tight. The queen passed once in the distance, her laughter ringing out as she leaned close to a visiting noble, gesturing toward Amelie as though pointing to a curious animal. The noble smiled faintly but did not approach. Amelie kept her eyes lowered, though she could feel the heat of their gaze. Late in the afternoon the pond began to change again. The breeze died entirely, yet the water stirred as though something beneath it had moved. A slow swirl shifted the mud, revealing flashes of a lighter color below, golden almost. The light caught on the movement, sending a faint shimmer across the surface. Amelie's breath caught. She leaned closer, her fingertips brushing the water's edge. For the briefest moment she saw her own face as if through a veil of sunlight, her skin warm, her eyes alight with something fierce and unbroken. Then the sound of a drum cracked the air, snapping her back. The shimmer faded, the mud closing over whatever lay beneath. She sat back, her hands wet and cold, the taste of the pond still heavy on her tongue. Somewhere deep in the palace, the music quickened into a wild, joyous rhythm. Amelie closed her eyes and listened, letting the sound pour through her until it met that strange flicker in her chest, a small, stubborn spark that refused to be drowned. By the time the festival began to fade into evening, the courtyard had fallen into that quiet which feels almost expectant. The music had softened, replaced by the low hum of conversation and the clink of goblets somewhere deep in the palace. The sky overhead was shifting from gold to the bruised purple of dusk, the air heavy with the scent of smoke from the roasting fires. Amelie still knelt by the pond, her body aching from the long hours, her knees sunk into the damp earth as if the ground itself meant to keep her there. She dipped her hands again, the water cupping cool against her palms. It should have been still, there was no wind now, and even the leaves in the nearby trees hung motionless, but the surface rippled softly, like something beneath was breathing. She stilled, watching. The ripples widened and the image in the pond shifted. At first, she thought her eyes were playing tricks on her, the exhaustion of the day painting illusions over the brown water. But then the mud seemed to pull away, curling aside like smoke, until what stared back at her was not the ragged girl she knew. The figure in the water wore robes of deep, luminous gold, embroidered with threads that caught the light and made them burn like sunlight trapped in cloth. Around her head was a crown, delicate yet fierce, its shape unlike any she had ever seen in the palace. The woman's posture was tall, unyielding, her chin lifted in quiet command. Amelie's heart pounded. She leaned closer, breath trembling. The eyes in the water were hers, yet not. They held a weight she had never dared to show, a certainty that made her chest tighten. The lips of the reflection moved, though no sound broke the air. Instead, the words seemed to press directly into her mind, deep and clear. Gold comes from the earth and you from the mud. Rise. She froze, the words vibrating in her skull like the aftershock of a bell. She wanted to speak, to ask who, or what, was speaking to her, but her tongue lay heavy in her mouth. All she could do was stare as the figure in the pond held her gaze, the water shimmering faintly as if lit from within. Her hands shook and droplets slipped from her fingers into the pond. Then her tears followed, unbidden, falling one by one into the reflection. Each tear seemed to ignite the surface, the ripples glowing brighter until the entire pond shimmered like molten gold. It was beautiful and terrifying, a sight so unreal she almost pulled back in fear. But she could not. There was a pull, a gravity between her and the figure in the water that kept her leaning forward, caught in the promise of those words. The glow began to fade as the last of the light left the sky. The golden woman's image softened, the robes blurring into shadow, the crown melting into the dark surface until only Amelie's familiar dirt-streaked face stared back. She blinked, and the pond was again the same still, muddy water she had always known. But her chest felt different, as though something there had been cracked open to let in light. That night, sleep took her quickly, but it was no ordinary rest. Her dreams bloomed vivid and heavy, pulling her into places that felt both strange and achingly familiar. She saw her mother, not as she had been in sickness but strong and bright-eyed, wearing a dress the color of the setting sun. Her voice was clear in the dream as it had not been in years. "You are not who they say you are," she told Amelie. "They have hidden your name, your blood, but it cannot be buried forever." Images unfurled behind her mother's voice, the second queen in a darkened chamber, leaning close to a servant, pressing coins into their palm. The gleam of a cup laced with something darker than wine. The king's face turned away unaware. Her mother's body still beneath thin blankets, a shadow withdrawing from the hut. Then came flashes of another life, stone halls carved with symbols she had never seen, elders bowing their heads to a young woman robed in gold, a crown being lowered onto her hair. She felt the weight of it, not as a burden, but as something that fit, something that had always been meant for her. Her mother's voice wove through it all. "They feared what you might become. They covered you in mud so you would not see your own shine. But the earth remembers, Amelie. The water remembers. And soon so will they." Amelie woke with her heart hammering, the taste of the pond's water still lingering on her lips. The festival was over. The courtyard outside her small sleeping space lay in darkness. But she could still feel it, that strange shimmer in her chest, the echo of the words from the water. She lay there for a long time, staring into the blackness, her mind alive with visions that refused to fade. Somewhere deep inside, the spark caught and burned a little brighter. The days after the festival carried a strange shift, one the second queen felt before she fully understood it. Amelie still bowed her head, still kept to her work, still obeyed every order, but there was a quietness to her now that was no longer submission. It was as if the girl had tucked something precious inside herself, something untouchable, and the queen could not abide it. She had spent years grinding that spark down to nothing. The thought of it returning made her restless. So she devised what she believed would be the final blow, a public humiliation so complete that whatever small dignity Amelie carried would shatter for good. The opportunity came when a delegation from the eastern provinces arrived. Their visit meant to secure a trade agreement. The second queen planned a lavish midday feast in their honor, with tables heavy under platters of roasted meats, fruits split open to reveal jeweled insides, and goblets brimming with spiced wine. Every detail was meant to display the palace's wealth and refinement. Every detail, except one. On the morning of the feast, the queen sent for Amelie. "You will provide a demonstration of our traditions," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "The guests will see how even our lowest servant honors the water that sustains us." She smiled, a glint of triumph in her eyes. Amelie understood what that meant before the queen even finished. She was to drink from the muddy pond in front of them all. By the time the guests were seated in the open courtyard, the queen had already sent a guard to stir the pond. Mud rose from the bottom in thick swirls, breaking the surface into greasy patterns. Bits of rotting leaves floated in the water, the smell of it heavy in the air. Amelie was led forward barefoot, her faded dress hanging loose on her thin frame. She felt the weight of the stairs, the foreign guests with their embroidered robes and polished boots, the palace servants pretending not to look, the guards with their smirking eyes. At the far end of the table, the second queen sat like a vulture dressed in silk, her lips curved just enough to show teeth. "Go on," the queen said lightly, her words meant to carry. "Show our honored guests the humility of service." Amelie knelt. The earth beneath her knees was wet from the guard's work, and it soaked into the fabric of her dress. She dipped her hands into the pond, the water cold and clinging, the smell rising to meet her. She lowered her head to drink. And then, just as her lips brushed the surface, it happened. The water stilled. The mud sank as if pulled by an unseen hand. Beneath it, light bloomed, soft at first, then brighter, until her reflection shone back at her clothed in gold. The crown was there, the proud tilt of the chin, the eyes alight with the same fierce certainty she had seen before. She froze, heart hammering. But this time it wasn't hers alone to see. A murmur rippled through the gathering. One of the guests leaned forward, eyes narrowing. A palace servant dropped a tray with a clatter. For the briefest breath, it was as if the entire courtyard held its inhale. Then the light blinked out. The mud closed over the image, leaving nothing but brown water. Amelie lifted her head slowly, the taste of the pond still on her tongue, her heartbeat loud in her ears. "What was that?" one of the guests asked, his voice low but not low enough. "A trick of the sun," the second queen replied without missing a beat. Her tone was casual, dismissive, but her hand tightened slightly on the stem of her goblet. "The light catches strangely here in the afternoons." She laughed softly as though humoring a child's question, and took a slow sip of wine. The guests did not press, but their glances at Amelie lingered longer than before, curious, measuring. The servants whispered behind lowered eyes, the sound barely more than breath. Amelie felt it, something had shifted again. The queen had meant to reduce her to dirt before the eyes of strangers, but instead she had shown them a glimpse of something she could not explain away. Amelie returned to her duties without a word, but as she passed the queen's table, their eyes met for the first time in years. The queen's smile was still in place, but there was a crack in it now, a thin fracture running through her mask of control. And Amelie, without meaning to, let the faintest curve touch her own lips, not enough to be called a smile but enough to say, "I am not done." The night before the council, the palace hallways felt like the veins of some ancient creature, long, cold, and pulsing faintly with tension. Amelie was summoned without warning, her name spoken by a guard who didn't meet her eyes. She rose from her mat in the servants' quarters, her heart steady but her breath quick, and followed the call. The queen's orders were curt: carry this water to the royal hall. No. No explanation. No reason. Only the weight of eyes that seemed to want to pierce her bones. The jug she was handed was plain clay, worn smooth from years of use, but heavy with the chill of fresh water from the deep palace wells. She gripped it carefully, her fingers wrapping around its cool body, and made her way toward the hall where the political council would meet in the morning. The corridors were eerily empty at this hour, but she could feel the hum of anticipation. Something was about to crack open. She reached the hall where a few elders already sat, their robes deep with color and threaded with gold that caught the lantern light. They were murmuring about matters she could not hear, their voices low and heavy with the weight of kingdoms. She kept her head bowed as she stepped forward, the jug tilting toward the carved goblets laid out on the table. But as the first stream of water fell, the sound of it changed. It no longer splashed with the hollow thinness of water, but rang with a soft, heavy note, as though metal were flowing. Amelie froze. The elders leaned forward, their eyes catching the impossible sight. What poured from the jug was no longer clear, but molten gold, luminous, liquid, moving like sunlight made tangible. It pooled in the goblet, shimmering in steady ripples, and the air in the hall thickened with stunned silence. One elder's voice, cracked with age, broke through: "The mark, the sign." Another's face paled as he muttered of old prophecies, tales of a hidden heir whose presence would be revealed when the earth's gold flowed at her touch. Amelie's hands trembled as she set the jug down. She did not know whether to run or kneel. The king himself, seated at the far end of the hall, rose slowly from his carved throne. His gaze was unreadable but sharp as a blade. "Who is she?" he demanded, though the question seemed less about ignorance and more about confirming what he already feared. The queen stepped forward, her face a mask of disbelief so well feigned it was almost convincing. "She is nothing but a servant," she said, her voice sweetened with venom. "A girl taken in out of pity. This must be some trick of the light." But the elders were not so easily swayed. One of them, an old woman with eyes like storm clouds, studied Amelie more closely. "She has her mother's face," she murmured as if speaking to herself. Another nodded, recalling the queen's predecessor, a distant royal cousin who vanished from court decades ago after a scandal whispered but never confirmed. Amelie's bloodline, long buried beneath lies and cruelty, was beginning to surface like gold beneath the mud. The queen's hand tightened around her robe, the fabric bunching under her fingers. Panic flickered in her eyes, quick as a shadow passing across the sun. She had built her life, her power, on the certainty that Amelie would never rise from the dirt she had been forced to drink. And now, in front of witnesses who carried the weight of tradition and prophecy, that certainty was dissolving. Amelie stood still, her heart pounding but her gaze steady. She felt no need to defend herself. The truth was not something she had to speak. It was in the gold. It was in the way the air seemed to hum in her presence, in the whispers that wrapped around her name like a dawning storm. For the first time in years she did not feel small. The queen's world had just begun to crack. And Amelie knew the break was only beginning. The night before her banishment, the queen moved like a shadow through the corridors, her steps sharp with a purpose that tasted of fear. She could not strike Amelie down in the open, not with the elders watching, not with the whispers of prophecy already spreading like fire through dry grass. But exile? That could be dressed as mercy. The king would sign the order without question. A young servant girl sent away to a distant, thirsty province to serve, and be safe, was nothing in the eyes of a ruler blinded by years of the second queen's subtle venom. Amelie, though, felt the shift in the air before the words were even spoken. In her dreams, the water had been restless all week, the golden reflection now waiting for her the moment she knelt. She woke with a strange calmness in her chest, as if she were no longer walking toward doom but toward a gate only she could see. The queen summoned her at sunrise, draped in silks brighter than the morning. Her voice was sugar over steel. "You will go where you belong," she said. "Far from the noise of the palace, far from temptation." Then with a smile that cut like glass, "But first, you will drink. One last time. So you remember your place when the dust surrounds you." The words struck the gathered servants like an iron bell. Everyone knew what drink meant. They walked together into the courtyard, the queen at the head of a small procession, foreign guests, guards and gossip-hungry maids following. The pond awaited like a wound in the earth, its surface dark, its smell faintly sour after a night of stirred silt. The queen's personal guards had churned the bottom with long poles before dawn, ensuring the water was as foul as she desired. Amelie stepped forward slowly. The sky was still painted in the colors of early day, but something in the light seemed thicker, richer, as if the sun itself had lingered to watch. The queen's voice rang out for the crowd. "Kneel." Amelie obeyed, her knees sinking into the damp earth. She bent toward the water. The surface was chaos, brown swirls, flecks of leaves, tiny bubbles rising from the mud below. Yet when her fingertips touched it, the chaos stilled as though frozen by some unseen hand. The swirls began to separate, the brown pulling back like a tide, and beneath it bloomed a light. It was not the pale shimmer of the earlier days. It was molten, pure, gold, flowing upward from the depths, turning the water into a mirror of fire. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone dropped a tray. Someone else fell to their knees. The queen's face locked into an expression she could not control fast enough. Shock before fury, fear before denial. Amelie lifted the water in her cupped hands, and for the first time she drank it willingly. It slid over her tongue like warmth and sunlight, and as she rose, drops ran down her wrists, catching the light so that her skin seemed gilded. A single voice broke the stunned silence, "True queen." Then another echoed it. Then another. The words swelled into a chant that rolled like thunder over the courtyard. "True queen. True queen." The queen's lips tightened. She stepped forward as if to strike Amelie, but the guards, her own guards, hesitated. The water in the pond still glowed. The air felt thick with something ancient, something older than the king, older than the palace walls. Amelie's golden reflection stood tall in the pond, unblinking. And this time everyone could see it. Do you want me to keep the final chapter, Amelie's ascension and the queen's downfall, in the same vivid, cinematic style and word count? That's where the story would explode into the climax. The king sat in silence for a long time after the witnesses finished speaking. Before him lay scrolls of evidence, testimonies from guards who had turned against the second queen, old letters proving Amelie's mother had been poisoned, and the elders' own investigation revealing that Amelie's lineage was pure royal blood. The air in the council chamber was heavy, the kind that seemed to press down on shoulders and make even the boldest voices falter. The second queen tried to speak, her voice a tremble between rage and desperation, but the king's raised hand silenced her. His gaze was not merely stern, it was the look of a man realizing he had been living beside a serpent for years. "You have shamed this palace," he said, each word deliberate. "You have turned our traditions into weapons, and you have poured your poison into the lives of the innocent." The elders, ancient and solemn, stood together. "By the laws of the ancestors," the eldest intoned, "when gold rises from water unbidden, the rightful heir is revealed. Emily is not a servant. She is the blood of queens, the daughter of the late Princess Lethibo, and the rightful bearer of the crown." The words echoed in the marble hall like the toll of a deep bell. The queen's face twisted in denial. "She is nothing but a cursed child," she spat, but her voice broke halfway, cracking under the weight of the gathered stares. Even her closest allies stepped back, unwilling to be caught in the downfall they could all see unfolding. The king rose from his throne. "Take her to the west wing," he ordered the guards. "She will answer for her crimes before the people." 2 soldiers approached, and the second queen tried to push them away, her jewels clattering to the floor as she struggled. But it was useless. She was dragged from the chamber, her protests fading into the corridor. And then silence. The elders turned to Amelie. "Child of gold," one said, his voice softer now, "the ancestors have waited for this day. The crown has long been restless for its true bearer." The coronation was set for the next dawn. The first rays of sunlight spilled into the courtyard as Amelie stepped forward, dressed in golden robes that flowed like liquid in the morning breeze. Her crown was a band of hammered gold, simple yet radiant, the metal glinting with the same shimmer she had once seen in the muddy pond. The people gathered, pressing forward to glimpse her, some weeping openly, others bowing so low their foreheads touched the earth. As the elders placed the crown upon her head, a hush fell. Even the birds seemed to pause mid-song. She felt the weight, not just of the metal but of everything it meant. Her mother's death, her years of humiliation, the voice in the water that had told her to rise. The king stepped back, his face a mixture of regret and pride. "Rule wisely," he said. "Rule justly. And never forget where you came from." She nodded, though her eyes were already searching past the sea of faces. Beyond the palace gates she saw it, the muddy pond. It lay quiet, the surface smooth, but the water was no longer dark. It ran clear, sparkling under the sun, as if the gold had seeped into its very heart. Slowly Amelie walked toward it. The crowd parted to let her pass. She did not kneel, she did not reach for a drink, she only stood at its edge. For years, this had been the place of her deepest shame. Now, it reflected her crown, her robes, her steady gaze. Without a word she turned away. The chants of "True Queen" rose behind her, swelling like a tide. She walked back through the palace gates, each step a quiet promise. She would never again bow to cruelty, and she would make sure no one else in her kingdom was forced to drink from the mud. And so, the girl who had been made to drink from the filth now ruled with a crown of gold, the pond's final reflection forever engraved in the hearts of her people. The palace was quieter now, though not in the fearful way it once had been. Where once whispers hid behind locked doors, now laughter drifted through open corridors, and the air seemed lighter, as if the very walls had been relieved of a great burden. The second queen no longer moved among the gilded halls in her jeweled gowns. Stripped of her title, she wore plain garments of coarse fabric, her hair unadorned, her eyes dark with the weight of her fall. She was not sent away to some distant exile, for that would have been too merciful. Instead, she was made to remain within the palace walls, but at its lowest rung, the servants' quarters. Her chamber was small, its walls cracked, the air thick with the smell of wood smoke and boiled grain. She shared the space with the women who scrubbed floors and the men who hauled buckets of water. At dawn each day she was summoned to the muddy pond. The same pond where she had once ordered Amelie to kneel and drink like an animal. Only now when she bent to drink, the water remained dark, thick and foul. No shimmer of gold, no sudden clearing to reveal purity beneath, only the stench of stagnant earth. Her lips tightened with every swallow, but she drank because refusing meant further disgrace. The people watched. They gathered at the pond's edge, the way they once had for Amelie, but their eyes were no longer filled with pity or silent complicity. Now they stared openly, some with quiet satisfaction, others with cold indifference. There was no cruelty in their watching, it was the simple gravity of justice unfolding. The queen who had mocked another for lowering her head now found herself crouched in the same posture every day, her own reflection fractured and murky. Amelie, meanwhile, ruled not from the height of her crown alone, but from the depth of her memory. She carried the echoes of her suffering like a hidden compass, guiding her every decision. She remembered the nights she had slept with her clothes stiff from dried mud, the way her stomach had knotted with hunger, the way laughter from the palace had once seemed like a distant world she would never enter. And because she remembered, she never allowed such cruelty to take root again within her walls. Her reign was marked by small changes that rippled outward. Kitchen servants received warm food before the day's labor, the youngest workers were taught letters and numbers in the evenings, the elderly were given lighter duties instead of being cast aside. She listened when commoners spoke, even if their words were halting or unsure. The court, at first skeptical, found itself disarmed by her quiet authority. There was no thunder in her voice, no blinding display of power. Her strength was like the gold in the pond, hidden beneath the surface until the right touch revealed it. Seasons passed, and the pond itself became a place of peace rather than punishment. The banks were cleared of weeds, the mud no longer trampled into filth. Children came there in the afternoons, chasing each other in the sun, their laughter echoing over the water. Sometimes they leaned over the edge and gasped, for when they looked down, they saw their own faces reflected in gold. Not all at once, sometimes just a flicker, a ripple, but enough to make them giggle and call for their friends to see. They told each other stories that perhaps one day, they too would be chosen for greatness. Amelie often passed by the pond on her walks, but she never lingered. She did not need to kneel there again, nor did she need to see the gold to know it was still there. She carried its truth within her, that worth could grow in the most unlikely soil, that mud could be both a prison and a beginning. She walked on, her robes whispering against the stone, her crown catching the sunlight in the same way the water once had. Behind her, the sound of children's laughter rose, mingling with the hum of a kingdom at peace. And at the pond, the water shivered faintly in the breeze, holding its golden secret for those who knew how to look.